So when I was in middle school, one of my best friends moved with his family out of the house that he had grown up in. It was on this really nice side street right beside the fire hall in downtown Slippery Rock. And this was really shocking to me at the time, mainly because my friend had a summer lemonade stand, which he'd set up right in front of Bob Subs on Main Street, if any of you know Slippery Rock at all. And it had become something of a local institution, this lemonade stand. He had professionally printed banners. I understand he even had his borough permits and everything. And I guarantee that he broke $1,000 of profit every single summer. I was so jealous that he had cornered the market on the best business in Slippery Rock for a middle schooler. But sometime around the year 2007 or so, his dad decided they were going to go build a new house out in the country, just a quarter mile or so from Lake Arthur in Moraine State Park. And this property that they picked is this absolutely beautiful, really rustic location. It's high up on a hill, above a pond, right off a dirt road that cuts the whole way through the center of Moraine. It's in a patch of really deep and brushy woods that hasn't probably been logged in 100 years. And there are no neighbors for probably at least half a mile on any side. I think there's a cow field at the top, so there were some neighbors in the form of cows, and then there was an ancient graveyard at the bottom of the hill. It was the one that everyone in Slippery Rock High School said was haunted if you'd go at night, and everyone claimed to have seen a ghost. But those were the only neighbors, cows and ghosts. And this muddy driveway wound on seemingly forever that went up the hill. And I've wondered since then, his parents drove matching Toyota Avalons, and I wondered how 9 months of the year or any time it rained, they'd even get up to this house. But somehow they did, and they found this beautiful homestead for themselves. And this move to the country had been a really long time coming. So my friend's father had been saving money for many years because he had every intention of paying for the entirety of this new property and this new construction in cash. He'd been saving for a long time. And so that's what they did. They cleared the land, they graded the driveway, and they began to build their dream property. But this was in 2007, and some of you might remember what happened in 2008, less than a year into their construction project. The economy dropped through the floor, and the country suffered the worst downturn since the Great Depression. And my friend's family was left pretty devastated by that. His dad was in sales, which was really not the vocation to have at the time, and money that was previously allocated towards the building of this new house was now needed just to get by, pay the bills, to eat. And they hadn't even broken ground on the house yet. The only structure that was complete as the stock market hit the floor was their large 2-car garage. And I didn't know this had happened at the time. So whenever I first went to visit my friend in 9th grade, as high school began, my mom dropped me off at the top of their driveway, and you can imagine I was surprised to find out that my friend's new house was, in fact, that garage. And once you were inside, it was a garage from the outside, no doubt about it, but once you were inside, it was clear that it had been heavily modified. It had, by some creative drywalling and some carpeting, one stall had become a bedroom and a living room, and the other had become the kitchen and the dining room, and the upstairs was the parents' bedrooms up there. But it was still unmistakably a garage. It had the functioning electric garage doors still on either side that I guess you could open for unloading groceries straight into the kitchen, or furniture into the living room, or if you wanted a nice breeze in the evening with mosquitoes the size of groundhogs, this was a really nice way to do that. My friend's parents moved out of this place at some point when we were in college, I think. But for an entire decade, the only structure on that property was that garage, alongside a big green shipping container which essentially served as the garage to the garage. And as far as I know, that's still the case there. Their finances never again recovered to the place that a house could be built after being destroyed in the recession. They thought they had counted the cost they saved up for probably decades, but the realities of life intervened. There was likely not a whole bunch they could have done differently because no one's bank accounts or plans are immune from a global economic explosion. You can only do so much to protect yourself from that. They simply couldn't have counted the cost, couldn't have known what was just over the horizon and how it would set them back. And so their dream was left half done, and without any way to ever reach the goal that they set out for decades before. When it came down to it, there was just no way to salvage what they wanted to do, and eventually they just had to walk away. So in our reading today, Jesus is surrounded again by a crowd that also has some big dreams for what they want to do, because they're going to build themselves into disciples of Jesus Christ. And they too are leaving behind all they've ever known, the place where they've lived forever, you could say. This faith that they've grown up in with all their families, for all their lives, and they're picking a new kind of religion. One that's not rooted in the power and majesty of downtown Jerusalem, but one that's centered somewhere wild and beautiful out in the wilderness. I imagine that, like some of us, they caught a glimpse of the amazing things that Jesus was doing and decided at that moment that they were going to follow him wherever he headed. Maybe it was a miraculous healing. So at the beginning of this chapter in Luke, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. And maybe they saw him cast out demons like he did with that woman who was crippled and bent over for 18 years under the power of Satan. These would have left an impression on people, and they would have known this was a man worth following. Or maybe they never saw any of this, but just looked in his eyes and knew that Jesus was like no one they'd ever seen before. And so they followed him down the road, which is where we find them today. They just took off and followed him. Now, there's something amazing about a dramatic conversion moment like that, whenever you can pinpoint the minute that you decided to turn and follow Jesus down the road. Maybe for those of us here, it was one night at summer camp. I know some of you are Jamonville people, and I hear about that experience a lot. Maybe it was a retreat. Maybe it was a Billy Graham revival. You still hear that once or twice around. Maybe it was an altar call in church or something after a sermon that you thought was just for you. And for me, as I may have mentioned to some of you before, the moment I first really saw Jesus was during a Maundy Thursday service in the basement of Slippery Rock UMC. But conversion can't be like this peak of Christian life. It may be a mountaintop, but it's not the peak that we ride out from there. It's just like how clearing the land and laying a cornerstone of a new structure is not the culmination of building a new building. It's just the first step, the minimal step. Somewhere down the line, if we're converted, if we lay that foundation without ever counting the cost, we're going to find ourselves living in a garage where we expected our dream home of faith to be. Or just as likely, we're going to find ourselves just walking away from it all when it turns out that we can't follow through. But Jesus is unwilling to let us embark on this journey without telling us precisely what to expect, what to be prepared for. And it's really startling in this text how direct he is with those who are gathered around him. He's out traveling, and large crowds of people are traveling with him, Luke says. Large crowds, not just a dozen, but a crowd following him down the road. And you would think that these people are displaying some real commitment. They've already dropped whatever it is they were doing to follow this guy down the road, not knowing where he's going. They see him going, know they have to follow, and they go. And so you would think that Jesus might commend them for joining him, for seeking him out and deciding to follow along beside him. But that's really not what happens at all. The scene is just really strange. The way Luke puts it, it's almost as if Jesus stops in his tracks in the middle of this journey along the road and turns around to chastise everybody who's following him. So it would seem, first of all, that numerical growth in followers is not really a goal for Jesus. It's almost insane for us to watch Jesus surrounded by a mob of people dying to follow him and hear him say, "Now hold up, are you sure?" Because that's not really how church works for us. That's not how church has worked for a long time. There's an infinite supply of church growth books. There are consultants and software and techniques to maximize how many people we can get in to the pews, following along with Jesus, plugged into church programs. But Jesus has them already. He has them right there, following him in this large crowd on the road. And what he does, rather than trying to get them to stay, is pushes on them. He asks them pretty aggressively if they really even have any idea what they were doing. some kind of church growth program there. If I asked you every day at the end of church, are you sure you want to be here? I think it might have a bit of a counterproductive effect. But it's clear that what Luke is trying to tell us is that what matters isn't followers necessarily. Jesus is surrounded by followers as he's saying this all. But what matters is disciples, which is another step entirely. People who are willing to put Jesus before anything else, from family to possessions to life itself. So the Great Commission at the end of each of the Gospels invites us to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And obviously that means increasing the size of the church. But all of these disciples, it seems, aren't expected to just show up and be present, but to adhere to some really ridiculously high standards of discipleship as well. So listen to the first bomb that Jesus drops on his disciples here, on all those who are following him. Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Not even just cannot be a very good disciple. Cannot be my disciple. Today, I think we have a pretty strong tendency to associate the church with family values, for whatever that means. But it's clear that through the Gospels, through Acts, and many other places in the New Testament, that the early church was pretty firmly against the family values that ruled our time and that rule ours too. Jesus tells us that even our families must mean so little to us compared to him, that we're prepared to hate them. On top of Jesus' commandments right here, you look at Paul's telling people to avoid getting married if they can. You look at Jesus calling on other apostles to drop everything, families included, wife and kids, leave them behind, and follow him right now. I don't think Jesus is saying that families are bad, and I don't think we're expected to immediately just dump our spouses and kids and, go off and be missionaries or something. But when it comes down to it, there's no higher priority than God's calling. And it may well interfere with the priorities, the beliefs, and expectations of the people that we love. It will probably destroy our schedules. It will probably take us to places that we don't really want to be. Jesus may well call us to hate our own lives, everything that we've ever known and loved, and give it all up to humbly carry a cross. But the thing here is that none of us can ever say that we didn't know. Jesus is making sure that this is nothing at all like building a house or a tower and not having enough to finish. He comes right out and says it. He says that discipleship is going to cost us and that it's going to be wildly expensive. It's the loss of our relationships, if need be. It's death on a cross, if need be. Recession or not, it's like we're expected to write a blank check to God, but only if we know that check is going to clear. In fact, by the time we get to the final verse here, Jesus has kind of shifted gears. It's almost like he's not even asking us to count the cost anymore, to weigh out our resources, like this man building the tower or this king preparing to wage war. You get to the last verse and it's like Jesus said to himself, okay, they're not going to get it. And he just tells us right out what the cost is going to be. He's giving us, alongside the crowd around him, the price tag. And the price is absolutely everything that we have. After telling us that it's our families, it's our life itself, since we're expected to take up a cross, he asks for a down payment to prove that we're committed. And a down payment, obviously, is just kind of a small percentage of what the final cost is going to be. And the down payment here, this small portion of what the cost is every single possession that each one of these people following him has. Each one of us following him has. So Jesus' entire speech in this chapter, with every passing line, with each of these parables he gives, gets a little bit more and more uncomfortable. And you can just envision it as a handful of followers at a time just quietly peel on back and turn back on the road. until by the end of it, there's just a few left standing there. And by the end of it, I think it's fair to say that I'm itching to do the same thing. I suspect you are too. But at the same time, it's a gracious and a generous thing that Jesus lets us know ahead of time what we're getting into. Anyone who can't handle it is welcomed to get off the ride before it gets going. And yet the really wild thing about it is, I know that historically, real growth in the church somehow happens when these sorts of insane requirements are in play. Christianity spread across the entire world when preaching it involved the possibility of martyrdom. Only one of the 12 apostles is thought to have died of natural causes. And closer to the modern day, it's hard to imagine it now, but early Methodism was remarkably intense. Other Christians hated them in part because they made everybody else look so unserious about their faith. So John Wesley himself prayed for 4 hours every morning before he went to do anything, waking up at like 4 o'clock in the morning before sunrise to do it. Each of his Methodist societies, which were the predecessors of Methodist churches, visited the sick or the prisoners every single day. And you look at their schedule, there's still layouts of what they would do throughout the week that have remained, and you wonder how they physically did it. How did they have a job? How did they take care of their families while also keeping to the schedule that they did? And yet they did. And until almost 1900, after this church was founded, I guess, you weren't even allowed to be a member of a Methodist church without also belonging to a class meeting, which was a small group that joined together for prayer and accountability once a week. So you had to go to that every single week. You had to go to church every single week, and those are just the qualifications for membership in the Methodist Church. No exemptions were given for Sunday youth soccer tournaments or noontime Steelers games. Sometime I'd urge you to look up the general rules that Wesley wrote for the early Methodists that we're still technically bound by as members of the Methodist Church. No drunkenness, no working on the Sabbath, no giving loans at interest, no wearing gold or expensive clothes, no singing songs or reading books that do not tend to the knowledge or love of God. Meanwhile, they're expected to be in worship as often as possible. They're expected to take communion every time that they possibly could, to fast, to feed the hungry, to clothe people who have no clothes, to preach the gospel to everyone they met. And somehow, with these requirements, they exploded across England. They became the largest religion in America in something like 40 years. Somehow, God does the most with us and adds the most to our number when our commitment to the church and to Jesus is almost fanatical. Fanatical to the point where it makes everybody else look at you funny. And he gives us the strength to manage it and then works miracles through it. And I've got to tell you, I feel in the same way like the seminary classmates of mine who are most set for a fruitful ministry are those who didn't leave the house in the morning without praying for 2 hours. I don't know anybody who did John Wesley's 4 hours, but I know people who did 2 hours. And then there were those people who went to Episcopal morning prayer in the chapel every weekday at 7:30 a.m. Every weekday. To be clear, I tried once or twice, but I couldn't figure out how to use their prayer book, so I just got frustrated and gave up. And I've also never been able to pray for too long without dozing off. But the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane did the same thing, and I'm working on it. So this, for me, is a work in progress. This total commitment, this taking up my cross and giving up all else. I've never been the kind of guy who can pray for hours, and only this past month have I managed to commit myself to a standardized, regular daily prayer practice. I was able to commit myself to twice-a-week chapel during seminary, and I was blessed by that. And I tell you that whenever I missed communion for one single week, I could feel it. There's something to be said for these requirements that Wesley and that the early Christians gave for building us up too. And to be even more open with you, I'm striving to tithe, all the while watching my student loans run at me like a speeding train. So we're going to see how God gets us through that. Because Jesus asks for it all and gives us permission to walk away if we're not going to be able to do it, so we don't end up stranded in a half-built house. And for most of us, me included, we're not where he wants us to be yet. But we've got to try, we've got to keep pressing onward and upward towards the goal. Jesus asks for it all, that we cast our crowns down at his feet and pick up a cross instead. But he gives us more than we ever could have achieved on our own when we do it. Give up our families, and Jesus gives us the church, a family of saints united across space and time around the world. Give up our lives and take up our crosses, and Jesus gives us resurrection. Give up all your possessions, and Jesus will give you eternal life in a world without end. So count the cost. Jesus lays it right out there for you. And then write Jesus a blank check. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.